Hi, good evening. I'm Farzana. I'm Associate Professor of Architecture at the New York Institute of Technology, School of Architecture and Design. I'd like to welcome everyone to this evening's event, one that's part of a series this fall, conceived by the Lectures and Events Committee and in coordination with our Dean, Maria Perverlin. A special thank you to both our Dean as well as our two speakers tonight, and as well as all faculty and staff that are involved in coordinating this event. We've had a really robust turnout this fall at all of our events, including those that we've just had recently, focusing on the future of the city, architectural research in the context of our two new MS programs in computational technologies and health and design, on the issues of critical density, and also finally at last week's launch of the Data Matter Design book. So I think we've very successfully covered a number of very pertinent topics in this fall's lecture series, and tonight's topic on watershed development and management is timely as well. So this evening I have the absolute pleasure of introducing you to our two speakers, Professors Michael Schwarting and Francis Campani, both of whom I'm so very glad to also be able to call my friends. I've enjoyed a long relationship with them over the years now, always met with the kindest words of encouragement, generous support, and collaboration. Tonight they will lecture on their work on the Port Jefferson Long Island Waterfront Plan and the Watershed Management Plan. Michael Schwarting is a well-respected architect, urban designer, and professor, and a member of the School of Architecture Design community since 1987. He has touched students not only teaching here at NYT, but at a number of other institutions, including Columbia, Yale, UPenn, Cornell, the Cooper Union, and Syracuse. Among his many achievements is his recently published book, Rome, Urban Formation and Transformation. It's acclaimed as one of the best books out there on Rome, and it's a true gift to our students to have the opportunity to travel with him firsthand year after year. Francis Campani is not only an experienced architect and professor, but also a prolific and talented artist. Her work in painting influencing her architecture and vice versa. Every so often, we are so privileged to get glimpses of her beautiful compositions of still lifes and portraits in oil, pastel, and charcoal, whether recognized in an acclaimed show, posted on social media. And now, I think if you squint hard enough on Zoom, you might be able to catch a painting or two, or maybe three in the background on the walls of their lovely home. Together, they established Campani and Schwarting Architects in 2000 and represent decades of experience working at various scales in both architecture and urban design, with projects ranging from residential to commercial to office to public and institutional. They have enjoyed success in more ways that can be listed tonight, but a recent highlight includes finding a permanent home for Frey's Luminaire House at the Palm Springs Art Museum after 25 years of advocacy, documentation, and research. A publication is forthcoming on this work. They also have a longstanding commitment to improving public space in their communities, and perhaps this is the topic for tonight. So with that, and without further ado, please welcome our two speakers.
Thank you, Farzana, for getting this all started and the kind words about the both of us. We're a sort of tag team tonight. I feel sort of that I should say, you can interrupt this program with groundbreaking news if it occurs on this particular evening. In any case, we'll hopefully divert you from the anxieties of the last week or so, or even longer, and talk about a project. We want to talk quite directly to the students. We want to follow in the footsteps, and we're inspired by Jonathan Friedman's talk a few weeks back, that framing his talk in the idea of a thesis. We're not going to talk about a thesis, but we want to talk about issues related to that I think the students are involved in the graduate program in urban design. Both Francis and Farzana are teaching a site planning course, and so that enters into it, and other issues, including our studio students. So we want to talk about us, two academic practitioners, and in particular, we want to talk about our interests and our involvements in with urbanism. So we've been involved in a lot of things, but we want to concentrate on an ongoing project that we've been involved in our practice, and it in fact touched NYIT, as I'll explain later. Sorry. So in any case, we want to start and sort of frame this discussion about Port Jefferson in particular with a little bit, as I say, sort of inspired by Jonathan, kind of put it in terms of how we've come to this project, in a sense, or how we've come to NYIT and be architects and urbanists. I studied urban design at Cornell with Colin Rowe. Many of you know, particularly the students, having had read the mathematics of the ideal villa, the articles on transparency, and Rowe's later book on Collage City. I also studied briefly with Peter Eisenman at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. So urbanism came in there as a student. And then I studied in Rome for 2 years with a Rome Prize Fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. And that's where I started my pursuit of the issues that are in the book that Farzana, thank you, mentioned. So I've been involved in urban issues for a very long time, going back to student and trying to find ways to practice as well as study urbanism. I've practiced and taught since the 70s, mostly in New York City, and now in Long Island with the various partners, that sometimes by myself, sometimes in partnership. Briefly a partnership with Piero Sartogo, an architect in Rome, with Behan Karahan, a professor here at NYIT, and now with Francis Campani. And so we're going to start to share our screen and see if we can get to the pictures, which as architects we always like. This is a poster that in fact is all over town in different places, the banks and stuff, a photographer that has captured Port Jefferson in various photographs. This doesn't look like urbanism, although I thought of it as a little buildings around a piazza when I did it. But I bring this up to say that when I started practicing in Soho, it was at the moment when Mayor John Lindsay's administration created the first special zoning district, permitting artists to live and work in large, affordable lofts, which are no longer affordable. But at that time, it was a very interesting moment in New York City with not only the state of art and the place of New York City in the art world, but also the fact that New York City began to look at urban issues in a different way with Lindsay's urban design group. And it's interesting that this was the first special district of which now there are many. My other sort of next foray into urbanism was a commission with the Fashion Institute of Technology to transform 27th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue into a pedestrian space, which we called the Campus Walk, and to try to put all the disparate buildings into an image of a place using the space of a street. It didn't get built, unfortunately. It won a PA award, which was nice for us. And we did get through the Euler procedure, which I wouldn't want to go into, but it's a very complicated uh, set of requirements to do a project, an urban project in New York City. Living in Soho and also in Tribeca, we got involved with the Tribeca Community Association and grants from New York State Council on the Arts, and studied Tribeca. But along the way of this, we also got a project to do the Franklin Street Station, IRT station in Tribeca. And we did the station itself, but we were also able, because the station is in a fairly prominent place in Tribeca, to do the canopy. I'm fond of it because it was my first roof and gutter. And so that it has an important place for me, not so much urban. But we were able to get a New York State Council of the Arts grant with the Tribeca Community Association and our community board. So we're now finding ways to work with the community constituents. And we studied the leftover triangular spaces in Tribeca to try to sort of repurpose those into small sort of landmark nodes, and to tie them together in ways that would, where the paving, the planting, the furnishing, and so forth would make a relationship of the various triangles. There were 12 spaces we studied. And we were able, with the DOT, to build one, Bogardus Park Triangle, down at Chambers and Hudson, which has already been changed. But that each space had a different kind of use related to its place in Tribeca. We got a project to do on 23rd Street, Stuyvesant Cove, it was called, with the landscape architects, Heinz Ruddick. We did a stretch of planning on the waterfront of the East River, including a kind of trying to take the large parking garage and add things to it so it could become a public place, as well as a small ecology center down at the bottom of the image that was to study and show what's happening in the East River. This didn't happen, although Stuyvesant Cove is being made into a park. I'm going to turn this over. I landed in Port Jefferson after those projects in New York City. And it's been great to be in a small village where we have a good understanding of how things work, not just in our practice, but how the social and cultural institutions of a small town work.
Okay, I'll just talk about this slide and the next two, and then we'll get right into the waterfront design. We did a few projects in Port Jefferson. The one on the lower right, I did actually before Michael and I started working together, and this was a clock museum. The Historical Society of Port Jefferson was given an enormous collection of clocks and given a little bit of money to make a building for it on the grounds of their other, the museum itself, which is an old house. So that was the Historical Society of Port Jeff. The one on the lower, I'm sorry, that's on the lower right. And the lower left is the Port Jefferson Free Library, and we actually did some renovations to that, including a new entryway. The mixed-use building at the top is actually was not a civic project, it was a private project, but it's right on Main Street, and was a nice chance for us to kind of get into the downtown itself. It's housing 6 apartments above and commercial spaces down below. I've practiced in Port Jefferson since 1985, and Port Jeff is something of a college town for SUNY Stony Brook, so I did a fair amount of work for faculty in their own renovating their dilapidated Victorian houses. This is a project in the nearby town of Mount Sinai, village of Mount Sinai, just east of Port Jefferson. It was a community group who recognized a 17-acre tract of land that was about to be, it had been a farm, a sod farm, you know, for the students. Sod is that grass you grow and you kind of roll it up and like a carpet and bring it somewhere else. But it was going to be sold to Home Depot, and the community, the Civic Association had hoped to keep it for a park. They were able to purchase the tip of this, what they called the wedge, its shape, and actually not only stopped Home Depot from buying it, but got Suffolk County to buy the rest of the land, and got Home Depot to even donate some money. And we made this park and community center in the shape of a barn. The town of Brookhaven constructed the park. They were interested in ball fields. The community was interested in a passive park and trails, running and walking trails. So we actually tried to negotiate the trails, both straight vista walkways and curvilinear trails around the ball fields that the town insisted on. So the county bought the property, the town built the park, and the little community group had that little tip of the wedge, and they wanted this civic center, a kind of barn, both to be the focus and to house their activities, but also was a source of revenue for them. And we built it, we built the first phase and designed the later phases, which become like a barn. If you get more animals, you can have more space. So that was those projects. Then we got, oh, I forgot about this one. We got, as we worked on the downtown of Port Jefferson, the waterfront, the village was also interested in improvements to their upper port, the south end of town, which is up by the train station. We did some work with the planning board to revise the zoning requirements for developing housing there. But then we got a project that was a joint project between the village and the LIRR. Was actually rather nice train station building, but a really disastrous parking area in front of it. And we tried to make a piazza to connect the train station to the main street, which you see in this drawing. Well, both drawings on the left and the view up above. So now we're back to the harbor.
She just tagged me. And we're going to present this Port Jefferson project. It's actually two projects that we received, two different commissions, and I'll explain the first one, and Francis will discuss the second one. The first one started with the idea, looking at this image of Port Jefferson. There's a ferry right in the center of town that goes out of the harbor and across to Bridgeport, Connecticut. So there's a kind of interesting transit hub with that train station that the LIRR that Francis just described up the hill. And over time, a harbor that's gone from industrial to, unfortunately, parking. And we've proposed, and the village has actually begun the project of trying to change the whole waterfront to open park space. It actually started when I was directing the graduate program in urban design, and my studio at that time studied this idea of taking the parking off of the harbor and making something. The students did lots of different things, which we presented at the Village Center in Port Jefferson, and with the model that you see on the right that we made after the presentation with the students. And we were asked by the mayor after the NYIT project to continue to work on the project with a small, very small fee, provided by the village and also the Business Improvement District, which I actually for a while was a member of, so another community involvement. But the idea, and this is the exhibition that we had in the Village Center that had some of the student work, but it was the sort of second phase of our work with the mayor and the trustees of the village and the Business Improvement District, which sponsored the exhibition. So we have some historical documentation that is sort of critical to understanding what the issue is. And this image captures both projects in a sense, the harbor front in the foreground and the kind of half bowl shape of the village of Port Jefferson itself that starts up on a high ridge created by the terminal moraine that Francis will talk about. And that project of the problems of the water coming from the south. I'm going to talk about the problems of water coming from the north. And we're hoping to do a study combining the two with the village. So it was a very industrial port. It had huge shipbuilding businesses on it that were kind of astonishing for us to even imagine them being here. But not only shipbuilding, but then they became an oil terminal, a terminus that really didn't do nice things to the ground, water conditions. Oops, sorry, my cat is in the way. So the village has lots of pictures of the shipbuilding, but this is right at the harbor, basically where the ferry goes out today, and various images of the port as a kind of industrial operation. There's also, should mention that Port Jefferson's original name was Drowned Meadow, not a very popular name, but it was called Drowned Meadow because there was a salty marsh in what is now the whole downtown area of the village, and Francis will pick that up too. So this is sort of Port Jefferson today. Brookhaven has a nice, wonderful marina. The pier that jets out with the tugboats on it has the ferry service to Bridgeport. We often say that the ferry is the most beautiful building in the village, but when it's not there, it's not there. But one of the things you can see behind the nice marina and the water is parking. Continuous parking, going back to what's called West Broadway, and Main Street is going off in the to the south. Hope you can see my arrow pointing in that direction, up the hill to the train station. And this is an aerial view of the site for our grant. We were given a commission to work on a grant the village got from New York State Department of Environment and Water. In 2012, we worked on a study that followed what we had done with, that I had done with NYIT students and we had done with the mayor and the bid, to go deeper into trying to transform the waterfront. And the idea was to remove the parking, find other places for the 305 cars that were on the waterfront, some of it staying, but most of that parking doesn't belong to the village. It's for Brookhaven's marina. So it has a complicated jurisdiction. Over on the left side, you see a whole bunch of parked boats. That's a boat storage location. In front of it is a parking area that has, it's abandoned in this image, but it has spaces for trailers, boat trailers, and a ramp to put boats into the water, also run by the town of Brookhaven. Up to the upper part of the image we now can see a ferry in the ferry dock on the pier. There's one coming in. You can see it up in the top corner. And then there's a marina to the right side, the east side of the harbor, which has a, this is a private portion of the harbor with a hotel and what they sometimes call a boatel, where boats can park and people can stay. And then to the far right is a park that the village built, removing oil tanks and remediating the ground and making the first park. And our proposal was to try to connect that situation at the top all the way down as far as possible across the whole harbor front. And this is Main Street coming down sort of diagonally from the upper hills of Port Jefferson village into the heart of the downtown, which you see in the kind of lower right. So this was our proposal. It had a whole bunch of parts to it, but essentially it was to replace parking with a park, but accommodating the parking, and I'll talk about that towards the end. But the park is about 11 acres, and it's the stretch from the ferry to the boat ramp on the left is about 1,000 feet. And you can see the parts. The 1, 2, 3 over on the far left is the boat ramp restructured with a new ramp because the present one doesn't work properly, but also being able to rationalize it into smaller space and get 130 spaces from the proposed park over to that area. The 4 in the right at the edge of the boat dock, my arrow is lost, is a commercial fishing shop. Then we get the park starting, and the park has a number of components. Village Hall is across West Broadway. Hopefully you can see where I'm pointing, with a connection to war memorials that exist today in a very small little bit of park. And we were trying to formalize that relationship of the Village Hall into the park. To the left of that, we proposed an amphitheater, but where number 5 is, it's a commercial fishing area where there's boats that take people out to go fishing daily, several different businesses. 8 is some remaining parking for Brookhaven's marina. Number 9, in the middle, you can see the blue creek. The water that Francis is going to talk about is very strongly present coming down to the harbor from the hills, called Mill Creek. There was once a mill that used that running water, but it goes underground at West Broadway. And our proposal at number 9 was to what's called daylighting, to open up the culvert and connect the creek back to the harbor and make a feature of that in the park, a kind of ecological feature. Number 10 was a proposal for a town plaza. Port Jefferson, like many towns, doesn't have exactly a kind of there where we'd say this is the center of the town. Most people think it's the stoplight between West Broadway and Main Street, just in front of number 10. So we proposed to try to link more carefully the village to the harbor front with the civic space, number 10, which is adjacent to number 11, which is the ferry. And we had discussions with the owner of the Bridgeport Port Jefferson ferry business to negotiate a possible pedestrian crossings that would make it our park proposal more continuous and contiguous with the existing park in the upper right-hand corner. Hopefully that explains the basic concept. This is a drawing we produced for the exhibition, the show. You can see in the up kind of center top part, the creek coming down and going to the waterfront, and basically a kind of greening of the harbor. Real briefly, some of the parts, the one of the creek being daylighted, and we did 3 or 4 different schemes for accessing, being able to go down by the water, but also that it would mitigate flooding conditions in different ways. So it was meant to be functional, as well as this idea of the mill creek coming to the harbor. And the amphitheater over to the other side, you can see in the little sketch to the left, the village hall coming up to kind of nest in with the idea of an amphitheater. The village has a concert series every summer, and this would be accommodated so you would actually be able to have the view of the harbor behind the stage. And the town square, number 1 and 2, bringing people from Main Street, which is directly below 1, 2, and 3, coming into it, a difficult traffic condition of what's called East Main to the right, East Broadway to the right, West Broadway to the left, and Main Street down, all converging to make it difficult for the village to connect to the harbor. So that was an issue we had to struggle with quite a bit in the design. And finally, taking some of the village space right at the harbor where the Botel Motel is, to connect finally over to the east to the park that was being built by the village. We made lots of images in our exhibition. We had, as part of the commission, we had several public presentations and meetings. We got feedback. We did a survey with comments partway through the project, and these illustrations were quite important to that process, public process. A drawing which you can see on the left-hand side is a parking garage. And one of our proposals, actually going back to the bid and trustee work, was to suggest that instead of putting parking on big slabs of asphalt, making it rather unpleasant behind Main Street, that a parking garage, a structure, could make more interesting pedestrian muse spaces and so forth back behind Main Street. A typical project and problem of small town America, and particularly noticeable in the small towns on Long Island, that the more popular the main street or downtown becomes, the more cars come and the more parking comes, and there's less nice civic space in the downtown. So this is that main junction. The parking garage is with the solar panels. It was intended to be a automated garage. The cars get parked automatically. It exists. It's being built around the world. To the town square in the lower left. We were also, as part of the grant study, studied Main Street, removing parking along one side of it to create wider sidewalks and more of a connection out to the harbor. And sort of lastly, the idea of the parking garages. Our final project didn't include parking garages. We were able to find places for the 300 cars to go from the waterfront, but the original project with the bid and the mayor was to be able to double the parking in the village. They wanted to look to the future. not to the future when the car goes away, unfortunately, but to the possibility of accommodating an increase in parking. Our thoughts always were when the car goes away, we have a nice building we could build lofts in and stuff. So we did a whole structure of a bond issue to be able to produce a parking garage for the village as part of the study. And the left is a view from a quite nice public pedestrian space looking across Main Street to the east. And the lower view is what is the garage, the possibility of a garage that could become other things in the future with its solar panels, and trying to define a more pedestrian-oriented and scaled space. And the right is coming into that area from another direction, the present parking garage with the garage on the right. A final sort of rendering with the creek coming in again and the parking garage in place. And the final presentation to the community with our project and our public presentation. And ending that part of it before going to the floods, I should say the village has, with our assistance and the project that Francis is going to present, has been able to get another grant to update the village comprehensive plan, to which our study that I've just presented is an appendix, and to update it with directed towards issues of flooding and stormwater mitigation. So I will tag Frances,
Okay.
And she will.
Yes, so as we looked at the waterfront, we understood that there were benefits to taking the asphalt off the harbor area and the big expanses, not only at the harbor, but behind on either side of Main Street in the town. And so this is a picture of Drowned Meadow, looking very drowned. There's our mixed use building again. This is Main Street looking south from the intersection. And I just note, this is particularly for the students, that in fact, we had to, when we constructed this building, provide a dry flood-proofing method on the ground floor. So there were these kind of floodgates. And the students should note that's not permitted for residential use. The residential is above, but it is permitted for commercial. And it worked, but the town doesn't work because this flooding happened. And this happens on a regular basis. Basically, when there's a lot of rainfall and the tide is high, the water's coming down from the south and it's coming in from the north. And we have these crisis situations that happen pretty regularly. Here are two views of flooding at the firehouse, at the fire department, which is not that close to the harbor. And you'll see in a moment when we look at some of the maps that we've old maps and maps that we've made, how this landform operates. So this, the lower photo is recently, and the upper one I think is from the early 60s going on. More flood disasters, Main Street looking very scenic, but not passable. So we approached the village sort of having some understanding of what was going on, to make this other study. And what it did, as Michael mentioned, is to help the village apply for grants to actually put some of these mediation moves in place. So this is the study area. The orange line is the extent of the village, and the blue line is actually the watershed area. They're similar in many cases. The village does extend farther to the east, which drops down in the other direction. This is an old nautical map. We bring it because it's a beautiful map, but also because it sort of explains the sort of importance of the harbor to the village. It was this deep harbor, which was and the depth was partly man-made, was increased by dredging, and that permitted this industry of the past, the shipbuilding, but also of the present and the ferry transportation system. This is a map from, as you see, 1873, and you can see something that showed in some of the photographs that Michael showed, and I'll show some as well. The water's edge of the harbor was not where it is now. In fact, with the industry of boat building, that water's edge was always changing. The other thing you can see is the creek. Here's the creek, which at this point was quite extensive and continued up. And then there was another water body called Crystal Lake. So this whole area to the west of Main Street was marshy, and the creek went through. The creek now actually travels in another direction. The older street was East Main Street that bent around to the east. Main Street was called Jones Street, and it is for a while, and I'm not sure if it was the case at the time of this map, it was actually built like a bridge, so it was up above the marsh area. This is a map from 1917. We still have this creek that you see coming through to the harbor. You see on this is the placement of our current road, but this harbor front edge kept changing, and it would be sort of temporary structures to house this shipbuilding. At one point, the what's now West Broadway actually had a drawbridge, and apparently they could bring the ships back. You know, you could build the ships on the south side of Broadway and launch them at high tide because the tide would come up. There's Crystal Lake. Still, this map has a new street which is still in existence. It's called Barnum Avenue. And there is again a view of the harbor front with its shipbuilding, wonderful sail boat in here, and the various machine shops and things that happened. But some of that extension into the harbor was dock-like structures, so porous in themselves. This, Michael already showed this view, but you can see that some was built up and others were sort of more temporary structures. Hope you notice this gas ball back here. It landed from outer space. So here's a view looking toward the harbor. You can see the Crystal Lake in our view and the harbor beyond. And that Crystal Lake is more or less where the fire department is now. And there's the Crystal Lake looking we're on the west looking east toward Main Street. This again is the shipbuilding passing. You can see the infrastructure, the tracks to bring materials to the harbor. This is a fuzzy photograph, I'm sorry, but this shipbuilding continued on until the mid-70s. You can see from the vehicles. This is not an ancient photograph. It's not a very good photograph, but it's not an ancient. The last ship built in Port Jeff, I think, was right around 75. It's called the Enchantress. I think that's it. So here's a topo map of the study area. You can see the steep slopes forming this bowl that Michael described. So the three sides of the downtown are these slopes going up, with the watershed itself, and then the fourth side is the harbor. And so this map of the building footprints, as you can see the sort of patterns of development. It's a thinly disguised figure ground drawing because we're working with Michael Schwarting here. And this is a map showing the open spaces in the village, both the green ones and the gray ones. You notice that the gray ones are all concentrated there in the downtown area and by the harbor. And this combines the building footprints with the paved areas, both parking and roadways. It doesn't show the private paved areas since we get into the sort of residential district. So we're mostly looking at the roadways themselves. It doesn't account for driveways. We have to do an estimate on that calculation. And this is roadways and parking, and we did some percentages on the parts, the amount of downtown that is actually, rather the commercial district that's actually covered with asphalt. This is the sewer district. I should note that our study was dealing with a quantity of water rather than quality of water, but of course water quality is a big issue all over Long Island. And as you can see from the map, that not the whole village or not even the whole downtown is served by the sewer district, even though the plant is right there in the harbor. And then this is the groundwater conditions and it's kind of zoomed out format. You can see that the other issue that affects the flooding is that the groundwater, the aquifers, are actually getting higher as they get toward the North Shore, toward the harbor's edge. So we have the harbor water, we have the rainwater, and we have the aquifer, which is not that various aquifers, but the highest one is not that low below grade. And then this shows in a closer scale, zoomed in scale, the distance to groundwater below. And as you can see, that whole lower commercial district is close to that water as well as to the harbor water. Yeah. And then these are two maps, the FEMA flood map on the left and the slosh map, which is sea, land, and overland surges from hurricanes. And so we're in the sort of epicenter of that. You can see in this red area back here on the slosh map, that's also, you know, formerly the lake, currently the fire department. This was an important map for us. This was actually prepared when the village did a study of the Mill Creek itself and of their storm drainage system. It was made by Cashin engineers. It shows the drainage structures underneath the village, the placement of the grates, drains themselves, but also the piping system that organizes that whole web of tributaries. And we're going to zoom in here to this area at the village. And what we discovered is that there's a serious trunk culvert which connects into the creek. The creek is still existing. So that goes, picks up all these different pipes of storm drainage from around the village and connects it into this culvert, goes down to the creek. The creek travels toward the harbor, but before it gets to the harbor, it too gets pushed into a large pipe, and that goes out to the harbor. And there's a kind of flapper on that at the harbor. And so once again, when the water is flowing out and the tide is coming in, that becomes a real pressure system on this flood. This is a very hard to see photograph, but it actually shows that culvert. The culvert was put into place long ago. I don't remember the date.
WPA.
Yeah, so before, pre-World War II, and it sat above the marsh. So it's this big concrete culvert, and it sat within this marsh, but it was actually, the top of it was above grade. We heard, you know, in our gathering of these historical photographs and maps, we also have a lot of oral history of the village. And apparently the kids used to cut through the marsh, but they didn't want to walk in the swamp. So they would actually walk on top of this concrete culvert, which is about interior dimensions, about 5 feet by 4 feet. So the exterior is, you know, over 6 feet wide. So it was like this big concrete sidewalk that went through the marsh. And so here you see the creek that goes out to the harbor. So these are two maps we made, one of steep streets, which is important. That's on the left, the pink. So sort of identifying the streets in town, which are quite steep. These are important because even though these streets have drainage structures on them, they're so steep that even if that grate is kept clean, which is not always the case, the rainwater can just bypass it completely and head down the street. On the right then is a kind of a compilation of the drainage structures that are heading into that culvert, which is in the lighter blue there. And you can see that, you know, whether the water's coming down on top of the street or coming down under the street, there's a real pressure point where all of those tributaries hit the culvert. So then we also worked, got some great consultation from a man named Gilbert Hansen, who's a hydrologist at SUNY Stony Brook and has looked at water conditions on Long Island for a long time. He actually helped us with the LIDAR system of the topography of the village. And LIDAR stands for, what does LIDAR stand for? I forget. You guys know this. I've lost it already. It's the light imaging and ranging, right? And so we superimposed that LIDAR map on the aerial, and then we were able to also use those graphics to identify the lowest lying districts within the village, which are not just centered at the harbor, but also have this kind of backwater place farther up, farther south on Main Street. So once again, we looked at the district that we're studying, and we thought, well, what do we, to make recommendations on the conditions that we found and mapped. And so we looked to the publicly owned lands, because we felt in the short run, these are the places where we could make the recommendations and they could be put into place. In longer range, you would have to make some code changes to, and thus wait for someone to make a change in their property in order to get something in place, or unless you can use eminent domain. But there were plenty of publicly owned lands that could help in this process up here at the harbor's edge. The parking areas on either side of Main and the whole conditions there at the harbor, either owned by Brookhaven or owned by the village. And so we made a number of recommendations of projects that could happen and that could mitigate some of this condition of this impervious surfaces of the village and the existing parking areas. So our list of projects is on the left there. There's the existing creek, which we had already proposed to open up on the north side of Broadway. The existing culvert, which we're proposing to open up and daylight. The permeable paving, which could happen in the parking areas. The bioretention planters, which could go in various places. Rain gardens as well, and daylighting the creek. So we actually needed to present this to the village trustees and to the community. And so part of our task was sort of education about these different measures. And since Farzana and I insisted that our students come to this lecture, I'm going to describe what they are. And so the rain gardens are gardens to collect runoff from impervious surfaces, allowing the water to infiltrate into the ground and onto a bottom layer of stone to collect that water. These can be connected directly to a traditional storm sewer system, or if they're large enough, they can act on their own. And the bioretention plant, bioswales rather, similarly, they want to remove debris and pollution from the storm water and to slow things down and retain that water. Many of these systems are basically doing a similar job. And the idea is to spread the water out, to slow it down, and to absorb it in. And right now, in the steep streets and the paved conditions, none of those things are happening. The water's going very fast, it's not getting absorbed, and it's certainly not soaking in, and it's not spreading. It's in the bowl. So biodetention planters, similarly again, they can specialized planter in sidewalk area to manage street and sidewalk runoff. They're lined with permeable fabric, gravel and stone, and then plantings. The top of the grade must be lower than the grade of the paved surface. Otherwise, it's not going to do its job. So the water has to drain downwards, and the curbs have to open up either through a hole or a curb cut to allow that water from the paved surface to go into that planter. Tree trenches similarly can appear just like a standardized tree pit for street trees in the sidewalk, but these are connected. And so you can spread the water out, it waters the trees, and excess water can be drained off into a piping system. The permeable paver system, that is where you don't have a heavy traffic, for instance, in parking areas, particularly ones that are used in the summer and don't have to be plowed in the winter, you can use various paving systems which are not impervious. And then the daylighting of the creeks, which, as I said, we weren't in the flooding study charged with looking at water quality, but daylighting the creek can in fact fix the adverse conditions that come from covering over a natural water flow of nutrient pollution, and it degrades the habitat. But the other thing is that it opens up this closed system, so takes literally the pressure off what can happen with a overcharged culvert system, so that the water's not pushing out. So it can get absorbed more naturally in the immediate adjacent areas rather than get pushed all down to one focus area. And the street channels and rooftop detention were not ones that we specifically recommended in the short-term projects, but were also strategies that we presented to the community. And so then we identified places in the project where these strategies could be put into action. On the edges of the parking areas, some of the greenings, and this dotted line is where the creek, you can sort of see in the light photograph the creek, and this is where it would extend through to the harbor. That's dotted because it's not happening with that parking right where it is right now, but hopefully with the alteration of the parking area on the harbor to a more park-like condition, that can certainly happen. And then this is a little park near where there's the ferry pier. This is a small park which is actually owned by the village. This is a little greening area that could become a rain garden that we'll look at again. And we found, without the longer term project that Michael presented of a real transformation of the organization of the parking, there were still areas that we could put some of these moves into place at the ends of the trailer parking, the small areas between parking and park to make the park more useful as a water absorber than it is now just as a green lawn. And the bigger area is this one here, which is next to the parking at the west side of town. This is where the culvert goes under that grassy area. This is just to the north of the other one, where we have a little children's playground, some tennis courts, and some basketball courts. But in this area, we have a little bit larger area, and so we could do something at a little bit larger scale. So this is the small rain garden it's right across the street from the ferry dock, and it's in an area that is prone to flooding, not far from that intersection that Michael was talking about between Broadway and Main Street. And this is our imagery of transforming what's already there, this little fake paved walkway. It's one of those stamped concrete walkways, and that it really could become, this is not engineered yet, but could become a rain garden. And this is the larger area, where you can't see it in the photo above, which is the unaltered photo, but that's where this big concrete culvert goes through, and that could become and Open Creek area. So basically, we're talking about letting the water back into the village. Right now, the condition is this kind of barrier where the dry land stops and the harbor begins, and that wasn't the historic condition, and it's a condition that's not certainly working against keeping anyone dry. So I think we have to learn to live with the water. So in these two images, one from the first study and one from the second study, our major conclusion is that we've got to let the water back into the village on a regular basis, but not in the flooding conditions. So that's our study for now.
Great. Thank you, Francis and Michael. That was a fantastic presentation, and quite a bit of detail that I think is really useful, especially for our students. So thank you for that. So maybe I'll start with just a few questions,
Sure.
and then we can turn it over to our audience, who I'm sure is itching with questions as well. So, you know, I appreciate us looking at you know, a project of this scale, right? You know, it's small enough that you can wrap your head around it in terms of urban design, but big enough that it could have quite a bit of impact, right? And so in this day and age of you know, really pertinent topics of climate change and resiliency, and even with our current challenges, sort of the need for better quality of public space, health and wellness, quality of life, you know, walkable cities, and so on. I wonder if you can comment a little bit on the straddle that you often have as an urban designer between the very visionary and what could be a prototype and what could be essentially a new typology for this scale of small town on Long Island at the waterfront versus, you know, the very practical, right? The thing that can actually get built. And so, and maybe it's really a mix of those things, right? And, you know, on the visionary side, I can imagine, you know, someone coming in and saying, well, really, we need to restore the marsh, the entire marshland, and kind of remove all development and retreat back, right? And that's often a landscape urbanism move. And I don't imagine that would sit well with the local residents, you know, given that the area was called Drowned Meadow at first. There's probably a reason why it flooded the way it did, and it flooded well, right, in terms of keeping the water at bay. So from that to, you know, let's say visionary in terms of rethinking where parking goes. And so, you know, is there a possibility to say, well, we're gonna think through how, you know, to limit the number of cars at all in downtown, and, you know, actually take the parking and move it uphill, right, where the train station is, and so on. And so I wonder if you can maybe comment on, you know, those strategies or others that you maybe thought of, and how they relate to what in fact you finally proposed, and how you may think of this as potentially a prototype for other, a model that other towns can look at.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, a couple of things, I think. One, when I first came to Port Jefferson, and as I think I mentioned, having access to all the people who make decisions or try to get things done in a village, I was able to talk to the mayor right away and say, what's all this parking doing on the waterfront? Why do the cars get the best view of the harbor? And so that was a sort of funny question, because no one had ever even thought it was a problem before. So that became for the village, a kind of visionary thing, it seemed like a no-brainer to me to try to find a way to capture the harbor, which is the big identity of the village. The fact that it's a waterfront harbor village, but no one can really get to it because it's embedded with automobiles. So that became kind of opening thought for the village and the opening for us to be able to show that there was a way to do that no one had thought about, even though since 1960s they've been complaining about the problems of parking. So I asked the wrong question in a sense. They said, let's eliminate this parking somehow. But we were able to demonstrate that you could do that. Part of our plan, in relation to your question, I think, was also the notion of a sort of jitney system that would be public, small scale. They've actually tried it for a few summers now. They call it a trolley, but it just is like a bus painted to look like a trolley. But it would take people up to the train station because you're right, the Long Island Railroad parking lots, which are pretty vast, are pretty vacant on the weekends. And the village gets its parking problems on the weekends. So that's another sort of no-brainer. All you got to do is organize a way to get people to feel that they don't have to be within 100 feet of their car. And that's not easy. People want to be able to park right next to where they want to go. And so there needs to be a kind of cultural shift of some sort that demonstrates that, hey, I can have a free ride or a cheap ride. And that could be as pleasurable as driving around in a parking lot for 20 minutes trying to find a space. So there's easy arguments to make for substantial changes. And when we make our presentations, we bring that up and people say, oh yeah, but there's a real cultural condition in small town America where people want to park right next to where they want to go. And it's even worse not in the small towns on Long Island, but in the suburban mall, the early phase of the mall, where parking was put in front of the buildings. So when you drive down the streets, and you all know this, it's a kind of iconic image of America, that there's a bunch of parking, and behind that is the Dunkin' Donuts and the Stop and Shop and stuff like that. But the parking has to be so close, you can't even park behind the building to get to it. You've got to show that there's parking available to someone driving down the road to catch them. So there needs, I think you're right, it's hard to tell how the architect fits into this because it needs a bigger group of people talking about alternative ways of life.
Well, yeah, I mean, to follow up on that, it seems like when you work as an urban designer, you have to assume hats of all kinds, right? So in part, you have to think as a social scientist, in part, you have to think as an economist, because when you're talking about changing human behavior and culture, right, through the lens of the built environment, potentially you're questioning the role of the automobile in the future, right? Sure. And questioning, well, what is the future of the car? And is it right to have to park next to where you're going? Or perhaps is there an argument, an economic one, to be made about, foot traffic, for commercial, right? And so I wonder how that plays a part, whether it's through traffic studies and working with traffic engineers and kind of rethinking where the car should be in the neighborhood, and then convincing shop owners to say, well, actually this is good for you, right? Walking is good, and so on. So maybe.
But you bring up Yeah, you bring up really important points. I mean, there's also, I mean, the park on the harbor had something to do with the marina. So, I mean, you cannot imagine the arguments we had with boat owners about this parking lot. And I said, yeah, but sir, if you're on your boat for 8 hours, should your car have the best view of the harbor? Well, surely you can drop your stuff off and come back again. So there have been, and we mentioned to you, Farzana, that the issue of parking garages. Okay, if the cars have to be there, let's at least stuff them into a little package. But other people in the town went berserk over this because they thought somehow that a parking garage was the image of the end of the charming village, which we don't have. You know, right now we're just covered with asphalt. So the charming village is, you know, a myth. I mean, the waterfront is great. The boats are very nice, but there are kind of tags, sentimental tags that people hang on to that are really hard to shake. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the flip side of this is that because there is parking, and we, you know, the shops don't do that well, but they just feel like they're going to go under if they don't have this way to bring the tourists into town. But as a result, the shops also cater to the tourists, less so than to the residents. So there's another flip to this. Not that all residents, and it's pretty spread out. When you take the actual boundaries of the village, it's probably too far for everyone to walk to do their shopping. But at the same time, the mom and pop shops that actually cater to residents are not there. You can buy, you know, something made out of seashells, but you can't buy a vegetable.
So, you know, you're speaking of a lot of different stakeholders, right? So, you know, at the end of the day, I think you mentioned you had worked with the community quite a bit. It probably helps that you are longtime residents of the community. And so I know building trust is always a big part of this, right? So I wonder if you can also comment on your engagement and kind of, I know you mentioned you had exhibitions and there was an educational component, right? Because you have to teach people why these resiliency strategies are important and how they work. But not only for that, I wonder if you can comment about the friction of what residents and shop owners and sort of end users might have as feedback, as opposed to, let's say, policymakers, right? Or government officials that have a turnover over time. And so, you know, if the political party changes, you have to, you know, reapply and kind of, you know, reconvince. And so I wonder if you can talk about sort of that friction.
Well, I think one thing that I think we could say, and maybe for the students in a sense, that that it's very nice to be able to work in your town. As I showed my earlier projects in New York City, I could never tell where the next project was going to come from, and they were disconnected because the city is so vast. I did a Communicare thing for Dinkins and Dykeman houses. I did 13 fire stations, all kinds of things, but never could get a picture of the whole thing. And the thing about Port Jefferson, it's about 8,000 to 10,000 population, so it's a small town. Is that you can get to know your neighbors, your constituents that you would make proposals to. You get to know the mayor, and as you say, the mayor might not last long, so that's dangerous. But we've had a nice string of very supportive mayors that have been interested in doing civic projects, and now with the whole issue of rising tides and the storm surges, there's financial assistance that's possible to build the reputation of the town and the reputation of the mayor, in a sense, So that's all sort of been good. But I do think it's interesting in becoming an architect or involved in urban issues to be able to understand the kind of totality of the place and the problems of the place, and be able to articulate from the point of view of the architect what the physical situation is and what could happen, be able to describe a better future, and a way for people to have one of the big terms that often used is quality of life. Very difficult to define, but everyone throws it around. Is that there is a very important role for the architect and urban planner and designer to be able to actually say, look at this. This could be an image of quality of life. But then there's all the other issues to it. When we did the park in Mount Sinai, it was interesting because the public officials were astonished because it was the first time that three disparate public officials who were always debating each other and fighting with each other came together on the project. So they were quite intrigued by the fact that that a certain cooperation amongst public officials could get things done that they hadn't been able to do on their own.
So would you say that it's easier to get buy-in from the powers that be when you have situations where you are within a FEMA flood zone, right? So there are insurance issues and costs that are at play, right? There are perhaps legal policy issues at play. And, because you mentioned you have a slide on, let's say, the cost of structured parking, right? And so it's interesting to talk about the economics of a proposal like this. And you spoke about the land that you are intervening on being public land as opposed to private land. And so land ownership is something that comes up in all of this, right? And so I wonder, you've made quite a number of decisions, right? In kind of thinking through what can go where. And it's not solely based on resiliency measures, but rather things that can work in relationship to funding, that can work in terms of ownership. And so I wonder if you can just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in both studies, and I think Michael touched on this in the beginning, really had to deal with this interface between the incorporated village and the larger town of Brookhaven. And Long Island is full of this complicated web of political entities. So the village exists inside of the town of Brookhaven, but once they became incorporated in the 60s, they're sort of independent. They have their own mayor, they have their own government. But in fact, Brookhaven still owns the moorings and the dock, the public dock, and the area right at the harbor. So
the parking lot,
which is part of the boundary. So they are landowners. The big town is a landowner inside of the smaller incorporated village. So it's a sort of complicated process. And we've had good relationships with the larger town of Brookhaven as well. And I actually know the guy who's been the planner there, but I think he's retired.
Planning commissioner.
The planning commissioner. But, and Brookhaven generally has been somewhat cooperative, but said, as long as we don't have to pay for any of this, we're okay with it. And that includes the studies as well. So the village has really been our sponsor in the studies, but we have had to be communicator with the town.
But we did in our the plan that we drafted. It's a document that was approved by the trustees of the village and became part of the comprehensive plan. We did have to do a cost estimate, which makes you very nervous to present a cost estimate to a group of residents. And particularly the parking structure that we proposed, which a lot of people don't like garages, as Francis said, because it looks like it's the city creeping into the town. but we had to try to construct an economic argument as well. And in bigger planning projects, there is a kind of team effort. The people that did the comprehensive plan actually had an economist on the team, and other consultants that the traffic study was part of it, and so forth. So there were a bunch of things that had to come together, and one of them definitely was the economics and the issue about how can you do this. We're at a moment where things seem like there's a horrible problem of rising tides, but in fact, it's sort of ignited a political will to address the problem and put money to it. So there are grants and civic organizations and towns can get funding to solve problems. So it's one valuable part of the argument is, well, let's go get a grant. And much of our effort, which is weird because we've helped the village get the grants, and then we have to compete to get the project in some cases, which is, but we've actually almost done the grant by the time we get the grant approved. We had to demonstrate that the grant is fundable. You have to do an awful lot of work, which is proposed in the grant. So there's a little chasing around in a circle that goes there.
I see a hand over Jonathan's face.
Yeah, so I think we can open it up now. Jonathan, if you'd like to unmute.
There he is.
Hi.
You still have a hand over your face.
Lovely to see all this work. Speaking of rising tides and looking at the extreme contour situation of the site, I'm wondering if there's a way to make a grant for, let's say, Port Washington 2050, in which there's established a new datum that gives you a chance to play with section more.
Yeah. It's Port Jefferson, but that's okay.
I'm sorry, yes, Port Washington's got this way. I talk about that a lot. But I mean, if you were able to have, you know, a new arrival zone at plus 12 or 15 feet, then they could bury the parking garage down below, and then there's a pedestrian way to come out or whatever. And well, given both that there's a lot of hillside around it and rising tides, it seems like that could be a way to go.
That sounds good. You can work with us on that, Jonathan.
Well,
yeah, but I'll have to do all the work first before you want to do it.
Our one consultant, the Stony Brook geologist, hydrologist and geologist, pointed out that Drowned Meadow is still there. It's right underneath all that asphalt, just 3 feet below. So whenever there's anything proposed, going down is difficult, but going over might be something.
And maybe eventually the Drowned Meadow would return as a kind of refuge.
Right.
Well, the thing that's sort of interesting is, and Francis pointed it out in the kind of history of the village, the old Main Street was on the high ground and skirted the swamp, and was very rational. Then all of a sudden people got irrational and decided they're going to just build over the swamp.
Well, they had to get to the boat.
Right. But they did, the first time they did it as a more bridge-like condition rather than a terra firma.
Yeah.
I think Giovanni, you had your hand up.
Yes. Hi, Michael and Francis. Great. Thank you for sharing the work. I mean, I see in this work a kind of a very clear syntax and a very kind of structure approach from the 70s to today, from the scale of the loft to the scale of the city. There is an attention for what seems to be forgotten, right? What nobody's looking at, the corner on Broadway, or as And it seems that this attention for the detail and this idea of how to work and how to build your context, I know that is a word that Michael loves, so I'm using it, and how this context has been changing from the 70s to today. So it's becoming more and more complex and is involving phenomena that are not only part of the human choices, but they are also dealing with environmental kind of actions and reactions. So how is your idea of context change? I mean, I can see it's changed from the couple of years ago, but what do you think about it? What is the role of this extended context in your design process?
In terms of Port Jefferson or broader?
Broader.
Yeah. Well, there clearly are different scales of context, I think. And probably over time, as we've learned about urban design and so forth, there's been an expanded scale of investigation about context. The city itself and the conditions that make up the city of streets and spaces and so forth is one kind of context. But then now, and in fact, kind of beginning when I was a student, the idea of the regional context, that the city is dependent on a vaster area for all kinds of issues, infrastructure, infrastructural issues, but even the whole idea of community is a kind of expanding context. Context is also not just a physical issue. It's an economic and political and social issue. So your question is almost impossible to answer, I think. That those are always changing. It's all in flux when it comes to a complicated discussion about context. So I'm not sure what to say. For being interested in practice, I mean, we can talk about context when we're teaching, and that's easy to kind of explore the issues. When you're trying to practice, the context is kind of the job you can get, and the awareness and investigation that you can put towards that project to redefine it and define what the context is. So it's pretty much project-based. And we invented this project. We went to the village and said, this is a project. You could get money for this. We can help you do that. And so the context for that was, I think, the making up a project. And then talking about, and the context expanded when we got into trouble, when we had to deal, as Farzana's brought up, with all the political forces. And then we're dealing with the residents, dealing with the local mayor and trustees versus, as Francis mentioned, the Brookhaven planning commissioner. We were very lucky that I knew the planning commissioner, Tullio Bertoli, from meeting him in Rome. And that was a connection that allowed us to talk to Brookhaven and Port Jefferson at the same time when they couldn't talk to each other, because we could talk to both of them and say, this is what Brookhaven's telling us.
But the mayor has to be attentive to this too. I mean, our mayor serves for 2 years at a time. It's not very long for a project. It's a 2-year term. So she is really, you know, she's got to please her constituents in some way. And it's not necessarily the shop owners, it's the residents who vote for the mayor. And they're not necessarily the same people as the commercial district. So it's a very complicated process.
And the good fortune for Port Jefferson is she's in her 4th term. she's had the longevity where it's not guaranteed.
Great. Jeffrey, I think you have a question.
Hi.
Hi,
Hi.
Jeffrey.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it's super interesting in the sense that also, you know, I've done quite a bit of work in these smaller towns and was struggling kind of with a similar challenges that you're struggling with. So I'm just curious on a couple of points. Certainly, you just brought up the 2-year election cycle from the mayor, and I think it must be very difficult to sort of make a value proposition to the mayor for something that is a long-term investment that they will not see the rewards within the 2-year electoral cycle. So I guess I'm curious, and that's actually something that a lot of towns and cities are facing, is that, you know, why should elected officials make those kind of long-term investments when they won't see the actual rewards, you know, within their own, you know, 2-year time? So they might just say it's not worth it for me. So that was one kind of question, and another one is on the value proposition of green infrastructure. I mean, I think it's really, you know, you really hit the nail on the head, where you're looking at sort of win-win opportunities for green infrastructure and trying to sort of use kind of the value proposition to the city, to the town, around other knock-on effects that could be beneficial. And I wonder how, you know, you've constructed that argument to that constituency so that it's really compelling, such as, I don't know, maybe non-motorized transportation networks that might be aligned with maybe potential network of green infrastructure down the road to kind of address flood mitigation, you know, urban heat, you know, the shading from tree canopy cover, things of that nature. Because frankly, that map of the asphalt paving that you showed very briefly, that like is such a troubling map, because it just shows the cover, you know, the extent of asphalt coverage, you know, in an area that is actually very flood prone. So, so I guess my last question, there were three. The last one is really about back to management and governance. Have you, or has there been a parking authority that's been set up, or could there be a parking authority that could be set up where they could look to pool resources and sort of look at sort of either, as you had mentioned, shared parking, or even you talked about a parking structure, but maybe a hybrid parking structure that would have facade that would be perhaps shops and then parking behind. So just some questions.
In fact, our first just briefly, the first take on the garage was to do that, but it was found that we actually had enough shop space and we have empty shops, but that's in this particular condition. But there is a parking committee in town. They're residents and business people. Actually, they've recently changed, this is a great thing, they've changed their name from the parking committee to the transportation committee. So
good. That's actually very positive.
It is good. It is good. Progress. So that's progress, and they, you know, and they've tried. I mean, the idea of the jitney has kind of come and gone over the years. It was in place, it went away. You know, sort of moving people around. It got revived. I mean, before the pandemic, but it got revived with the notion of transporting potential, you know, money spenders to Port Jeff from SUNY Stony Brook, because they're actually, I mean, Stony Brook, the graduate students might be the last people on Long Island who don't have cars, you know, and so the idea that to make a communication was important. Yeah, I mean, probably Michael should talk. Michael was actually served on that committee for a while, but.
Yeah, before it became transportation. Well, no, you're I think the first two questions kind of, to me, were about this long-term project and short-term interests.
Right.
What we found is interesting. You can't really get people excited about the long-term. You got to keep that kind of in your pocket, I think, as something that is potentially made out of the short-term excitement or the problems. So the village has a number of problems that they are very up about and excited about and debate about. One is not enough parking for the commercial stuff to survive. The flooding now is, in their face. So you actually can't drive in downtown when there's a full moon and a high tide.
No,
No
not
kidding.
every full. And a rainstorm.
And a rainstorm. Yeah, those three things make.
You can't see the full moon, but
Yeah,
sorry.
we approached Venice. In fact, that's the system of floodproofing we used on our building with those shutters. But there is, in terms of, say, a mayor with 2 years, an interest in typically kind of making a mark and addressing the things that the mayor's constituents are complaining about and sort of asking for. And so these problems that are short-term need to be addressed, and the political base is interested in addressing those for their own re-election, in a sense, for their lives, in a sense, but also the fact that it makes a short-term project, getting the funding, defining a project and trying to go for the funding of it becomes the kind of goal of a politician. That if they can say, I helped get the funding for this project that you and the community have said you want, they look good. And then I think it's up to us to say, well, there's a big long-range component to this. Solving this can start to address a bunch of other things, and thinking about the future. Like we couldn't talk to the people in Port Jefferson about the future of the automobile. They just wouldn't talk to us about it. But we can think about it, and we can say, okay, we made a garage. We proposed a garage, an automated garage, to be sustainable, that the car gets parked automatically and people don't drive around forever looking for a space. And it's run by solar power, and it could have shops on the ground floor. We proposed shops. They said, no, we don't need shops. So we said, well, it could happen over time. It could be transformed to have shops if you need to. And if, when we never told anybody this, the automobile moves away or goes up the hill like Farzana suggests, which is a nice possible solution, then that building can become something else, can be transformed into a new kind of engine for Port Jefferson. So I think you're right that the long term is not going to be of interest to someone who has a short term lease on political life. But even a 2-year period has interested our mayors. We've lived through 3 mayors actually, into wanting to address problems of the village and say that they participated in moving it to something that's potentially doable.
So, Kente, I see your hand up, and if you can ask your question, I'd like to get the students ready, because I'd really love to hear from a student or two with a question. And I know at least a number of professors give extra credit for that. So just letting you know.
I'll make it very short. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. The first image you showed, it was, did you design the interior? They were like the loft, I think it's interior design.
That was my, yeah, that was my start on all kinds of things. As I said, I couched it in the fact that it was Mayor Lindsay's allowing artists to live in Soho. And so that, I built that myself. It was my office and my residence. So it started the whole, my involvement in practice.
There were like 4 classical columns and very modern piece at the side. So you. Yeah,
well, the shell was cast iron, a beautiful row of cast iron columns. That's a key element in it.
I thought like you don't have much difficulty dealing with the historical pieces and then adding like modern. And then like you mentioned, Courtney Rose, so probably like a collage city or other issues like regionalism, like Richard Meyer and Peter Eisman also worked on some project, peer project. And then also like in 1972, there was Urban Design Manhattan. Humphrey talked about that issue too. So like I was looking at your, presentation initially, it was more like a master plan. North of Broadway was more like a continuous park along the harbor, and along the main street, like you want to revive the, town. But like, there were like different water problems or different kind of like, property problems or parking problems. And it's hard to deal with all these things. But at the same time, in the end, I thought it was really interesting. Francis talked about like a more rain garden. It's more like a micro ecological strategy, more dealing like minor, easy to deal with. And then it also creates some kind of sequential like, design. But I don't know whether it was kind of like backdoor strategy to deal with the, like, or are they supposed to come together? Or if you can't handle, but you still can keep like, a micro ecological, like, design strategy.
No, well, we definitely want to, kind of open up the as Jeffrey pointed out, this disastrous amount of asphalt in the town, and then these strategies seem perfect for this. And the trouble is, it's piecemeal right now. The immediate proposal is not a sweeping one because we don't have the ability to do that, but we want to sort of start to peck away at that condition. But we do, we have the bigger picture in mind. And actually the bigger picture of the greening of the harbor came, we were not unaware of the flooding problem. We certainly wanted to open up this paved over condition, but the flooding problem per se as a pursuit came after the master plan.
But also what's interesting is the earlier 20th century solutions to that infrastructure issue in the city was to do it technologically, put it in pipes, put it underground, and get rid of it to someplace.
Yeah.
All those devices that Francis talked are natural solutions, and we all know that. I mean, that's what is a kind of proposed alternative to these mechanical solutions, and the natural solutions are visible. The wonderful thing about it is they can become a new image of a place, because if you need to select them sort of scientifically, that they collect water and they do all this stuff with water problems, but in their visible image quality, they can transform a place into a kind of new image where asphalt or ends of parking lots or in the middle of parking lots, if they're going to stay, can become also kind of natural solutions, but visible solutions for mostly related to botanical stuff, which is great.
Patrick Geddes' Valley section cut. I thought that Jonathan, like when he talked about Valley, it was like Patrick Geddes had like, fishermen, and then like different kind of like, vocations, and then the reason directly right next to that. So I think that's more like returning to the reason itself, finding solution what's based on what's there. Anyway, I should invite probably to students now.
So I'd like any students, invite any students with any questions they may have. If you don't want to speak up, you can chat it in the chat, and I'll read the question.
It's always hard to get students started.
They've hung on a long time.
So any questions from students?
Hi, I have a question.
Great.
Great.
Hello,
Marilyn.
Professor.
Hello.
How are you?
Yeah, haven't seen you since third year.
I know. Hopefully next semester I'll get to at least say hi. My question is that you said that you had to explain why like the bioswales and the natural resources were a good idea to like the first initial mayor. Did you have to keep like almost re-explaining that, as you said you've dealt with 3 different mayors at this point, to like keep the, you know, why and like keep that consistent through everyone?
Okay, well, it's an important question, because one of the things, the kind of fear of the urban designer, I think, the practicing urban designer, is that you make a big report and it goes on the shelf. We say that over and over again. Oh, the great report, it went on the shelf. And 3 years later, nobody even remembers where it is on the shelf. And so there is an issue about reminding people over and over again, I think. Even if the mayor doesn't change, you've got to mention it again to the mayor when there's an opportunity. And we've discovered, because we've been working on this for 10 years, basically, with the several grants. We had, Francis mentioned, we had one uptown. We did a planning study for Upper Port as well. So we've got that report sitting on a shelf somewhere too. And it is, I guess we feel a responsibility to keep bringing it up, because things do get lost. And part of our research was what were all the old plans since the 60s in the village that we would work off of. And we had to work hard to find them.
Yeah, actually the culvert plan, the plan of the drainage structures was already done. They didn't really come to any conclusions about it, but it was there for us to draw into. So.
Yeah, I mean, we worked actually with students on several, when I was doing some urban design studios, on some hamlet studies. That's a name for them out here on the island, where a community wants a study to be made about what they should do. And we worked on several of these with students, and a very wonderful planner, Lee Koppelman. Lee Koppelman was worked with Moses. He tells us that he argued to do things very differently on Long Island than what Robert Moses did. But in any case, he tried to get Nassau County and Suffolk County to talk to each other and to see the island as one thing. He's tried and argued that Long Island Sound is a thing between Connecticut and Long Island. So Long Island, it's the center, not the edge between New York State and Connecticut. It's the center of focus of things. So these things come up, and it's interesting with your question that we need to resurrect them constantly in different ways. And so I do think one of our tasks, probably the interface between production as an urban designer and the academic pursuit, is to resurrect the way things have been proposed and to build on them, and to keep reminding people that it's a kind of ongoing project, which is partly Jeffrey's question too, I think, about how do you invent a project that's going to take 20 years, maybe 30 years, and get anybody interested in it?
I actually think it's an important question that was asked. And, to follow up on that, maybe very briefly, in all of my work with community engagement as well, I often think, we don't have the digital platforms or tools out there that make previous studies and archives of previous work accessible. and transparent to communities at large, right? And so, and each time an urban designer is hired to do a study, they start from scratch and they have to go digging and do all this research as you guys have done. And so I wonder, as part of all this with your educational sort of commitment to the community, especially since you're longstanding residents, I wonder if part of next grant cycle is also the development of that archive or a development of a platform or tool that at least, at the very least, makes what your work has been about accessible to the public and able to be commented on and, enable a level of transparency that I think only builds trust.
Yeah, that's
accountability.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thing because every town has a planning board and a zoning board. And it was curious to me in New York City, particularly when there was Mayor Lindsay and the urban design group and a real interest in design issues. The planning board has no interest in the future. All they're doing is looking at projects that are proposed to them and reviewing them. And it isn't part of their the way they see their job definition to say, okay, we're planners. Why doesn't the planning board get involved in the kinds of things that we've been working on as grants? Because the village, that would create a certain kind of continuity because the planning board is ongoing and continuous.
So we have a student question in the chat from Saad. He says, thank you for the in-depth presentation. How do you go about the bidding process? Who did you have to compete against and what were the requirements for the grants?
Yeah, that's a good one. There is, whenever there's public money given to a project, to a community or whatever, there's a very strict set of guidelines of the process of accomplishing the grant. And the first thing is the village has to write up the grant to get the money, but also write up the grant to make an RFP, a request for proposals. And the RFP goes out, it's announced in the newspapers, and if the village or whoever is doing this has an interest in getting prices, they'll actually make a point to send it to different planning groups, offices and stuff to get them to answer the RFP. It's on Long Island, we don't quite fit in so easily because on Long Island, and I think it's fairly typical, there are these like 100-person planning offices.
Engineering usually.
And they're mostly driven by engineers. Right. They'll have a landscape architect in the back room when they need it. And they'll sometimes get a consultant for urban design because they don't even have the capacity to do that so well. But those are the companies that get projects, planning projects on Long Island and respond to these RFPs and are pretty successful. And then they make, they go through the planning process, which is described in the grant, that there are all these steps that you have to make certain public presentations and so forth. So it's articulated in the grant, and when it becomes a request for proposals, we write up a proposal. We've actually tried to get one with the Regional Plan Authority out here, but their costs were too high. But the competition is strange because it isn't urban designers at the focus of it. It's engineering firms that offer this kind of standard process procedure for making a study. And they're they're elaborate. And one part of the complexity of this is that you need to do, what's it called? I can't think of it now, even though we've had to be involved in it. But there's a kind of a planning sequence that you have to go through. SECRA, it's called.
Right.
SECRA. And so there are very fixed requirements that are set up in most public money grants for doing a project, and a request that you apply. The community will make a committee. The committee will review all the proposals that are due on a certain date, and they'll award a winner.
Yeah.
And part of that often is also a price. You have to say what it's going to cost you to deliver the goods to the community. And so the people that are evaluating it look at the firm that is applying and their background and their track record, as we sometimes call it, and also the financial proposal. And they're going to weigh these things and make a decision of who should spend the next 2 years doing this study.
I don't know. I hope that answers the question. Yeah. So it may be if you're a small designer, a firm, you will have to partner with someone else to sort of get the other part of the expertise into the picture.
So we have a environmental study, which also has a very standard process.
So we have an additional question from a student, Eddie, who says he's curious to know what are the sacrifices you have had to make to achieve a balance between meeting the needs of the community and politicians while attempting to design landscapes that are sustainable and provide some sort of resilience?
Well, I don't think we've had to make sacrifices except maybe getting torn up at the community meetings. Other than that, I mean, we make the, we keep plugging on the proposals that we think are good for the village, and sometimes people disagree with us and get very hot under the collar. But other than that, I don't think on our part I'm not sure I would portray it as a sacrifice.
Yeah, there's compromises for sure.
Yeah.
And there are embedded in your question different constituencies that aren't interested in the project for the same reasons. So there is clearly a kind of balancing act to kind of unite the different concerns of different groups. And we've found that it's pretty easy for an architect as the kind of negotiator to be able to talk to the local residents versus the politicians and get agreement. Somehow the architect or the urban designer you're not in it for yourself so much as the residents and the politicians are. So you're perceived, I think, as trying to assist in making decisions, good decisions. And you have to explain to the community in community language, which is not architectural language at all. You have to explain what's good about your project. What's good, not just the sort of aesthetic issues, the design issues, but what's good in it for the community. How is it affecting the quality of life? That's what they're interested in. And if you can make a good visual presentation, I mean, that's what we're good at. And communities love visual presentations.
Yeah.
I mean, the images inspire people. And so that's been useful. Good.
So we have one more question from Isaac. Presentation is very clear. Very much enjoyed it. Worth taking a break from homework for. in his mind, urban design is all about thinking for the future. So with that, parking garages seems to be something that'll become extinct. With ride sharing services and mass transit, his community alone has gotten rid of all the parking and shopping districts to allow for bus only lanes. In your opinion, if you're thinking about the future of this city, how does the impact of ride sharing affect your neighborhood? And if most visitors are using ride sharing services to visit your project, would that affect your decision on the parking garage?
Oh, that's a great question.
Thanks, Isaac.
Yeah. No, it's good. I mean, it's in a tiny way. In this community, I think that would be a great vision for the future. There's so much car ownership out in this kind of rather spread out town that it'll take some time to get there. But there have been these even ride sharing little systems started via some of the community groups, the BID, which is the Business Improvement District, who will give you a ride for nothing if you just call them up. I think this all fell apart last March when the COVID kicked in and people weren't getting in a car with one another anymore. But it was starting, and I think that's a great. It's a great question, and it would be wonderful. Just if you can think about if we didn't need these parking lots, you could reduce it so much, right? To just drop off areas that the swamp could come back. We don't want to drain the swamp. We want the swamp to come back to Port Jefferson, and that could be a great way to do it. I think the thing is you have to. I think Lee Koppelman once said that you have to get the landowners to get over the love affair that they have with their cars, because it's a kind of bonding issue with some longtime car owners.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think I sense it more in teaching the urban design studio than in the practice about thinking about the future of the automobile. We know it's going to change. We don't exactly know how and when it's going to happen, but there was an interesting exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York of proposals about changing the whole car way of life in the city, increasing the pedestrian space, reducing the amount of automobile space. And New York City has been doing that.
Yeah.
But I know a couple of semesters ago in the urban design studio, the students came in one day and said, look I found all this stuff online that people in the future are going to go from place to place in airplanes, in little airplanes. And someone brought this up. They showed me all the documentation of some future ideas about that makes a three-dimensional traffic jam as far as I could tell. But it's interesting to speculate on it, but we can't really say which way things are going to go. And this is, I think, in a particularly peculiar time where the automobile culture is going to change.
Right.
But it's going to change with everyone kind of kicking and screaming for a while. And that's happening now.
But even if you remember that, I mean, and of course it affected how Long Island developed. But if you remember the sort of figure grounds that we had Port Jeff, the inner part, all the little houses are really close together because that was the pre-automotive Port Jefferson. That was the walking Port Jefferson. And then they get farther and farther apart as you move out of that. So that web becomes more difficult.
I know in several lectures now, Michelle Bertoman's name has come up, and she did a number of interesting projects. One was maglev, bringing the maglev idea, which is levitating by magnetic processes to move vehicles around, and it's happened in Japan and other places. But she studied the network on Long Island, and a lot of people, Lee Koppelman in particular, understood a long time ago the peculiarities of Long Island are that all the transportation is going east-west, and most of the towns need connections north-south. So the issues about ride sharing, is there a kind of intermodal system that's a short range north-south to get to the east-west connection that connects Long Island to New York City? It's a network issue that involves new kinds of shared transportation probably to achieve. But now Long Island has a horrible system of buses that move north-south to try to connect to the train, but no one's ever made the schedules coincide. So the intermodal concept of changing, it has never been structured. But that would be, I mean, it seems like with all the big data discussions we had last week, there should be a way to resolve intermodal transportation and move farther and farther away from the private automobile to shared forms of transportation.
Sure.
So with that, are there any other additional questions?
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
all of you for coming.
Thank you, Farzana, for running the show, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, I'd like to end by thanking everyone for joining the conversation, and also to announce a few upcoming events in our lecture series. So next week we have two events. November 10th, we've got our next lecture by Kai Wei Bergman, partner at Björk Engels Group, followed by a lecture on the 11th by our own School of Architecture and Design faculty, Hyun-Tae Jung. Also of note is a lecture by Professor Nader Vesuvian, also on our School of Architecture and Design faculty, which has been rescheduled for November 23rd at 12 noon. And finally, on November 18th, we will have a symposium discussing the urbanism of the Southern China metropolis. So an exciting lineup of phenomenal speakers and events, and I do hope that you will join us. And with that, thank you and have a great night. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you so much, Francis.
We're happy to be part of it.
And thank you, old friends, for coming too.
Yes.